everybody this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining. Could I just ask at this point, I don't mean to put my hand up. I don't know why I'm putting my own hand up. Sorry. Yeah, if you can turn your cameras and mics off just for now, and just to say welcome to day 6 of the festival, so Lead, Connect and Care. For those that haven't been to any other sessions so far, we launched on World Kindness Day, which is the kind of underpinning theme for the festival. So if that's for leadership, for wellbeing and for the quality improvement element. What we've done is tended to start these sessions with one of the kindness videos from one of our senior leaders across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So at this point, I'll ask Joe just to play that video and then I'll introduce Ben. So thank you very much.
Kindness for me means showing others consideration, respect, giving time, giving advice, just giving a listening ear. It also means being supportive and honest with others, both in times of good and at times of challenge. I think kindness is important because we don't work in isolation, we don't work alone, we work in teams, we work in partnerships. So much of what we do depends on the relationships with others, and it's important that within those relationships we show the right behaviour towards others, and kindness means that our relationships are excellent and we can bring the best out of our work, and we can show that we can work together at different times in different ways, and we can show generosity to each other, support, and really work through both short, medium and long-term issues together. Yeah, I think in COVID, I saw a lot of people looking after each other, realised other people were going through really difficult times, and they made time for them. Above all, I think they listened, and they listened carefully, respectfully, and they allowed people to share their thoughts, difficulties, what was troubling them, and at times they just offered nothing more than that listening ear. But at times they also offered the kindness, which was by giving advice or giving support or making time for people in other ways. And I saw that again and again and again during COVID. And the results were really quite outstanding in terms of the response of people in those kind of relationships.
A random act of kindness, no matter how small, can make a tremendous impact on someone else's life. An act of kindness that I received during the COVID pandemic was when a colleague contacted me, because I'm clinically extremely vulnerable, to ask if I was okay and if I needed any advice and guidance. That meant the world to me. That was an act of kindness.
So I think kindness is just taking that little bit of extra time to think through not just what's going on, but how the person you're talking to is feeling. It's that sort of thoughtfulness about the other person's emotions and how they're feeling at a time. It's important because we get so used to just caring for people and treating people that we sometimes almost forget that they've got feelings too. You know, we see people as patients or conditions, and of course, you know, for the people we're talking to, their own emotional state might be, you know, very different from that which we were expecting. So it makes the real difference, I think, between just being treated and being looked after. That's the big difference. And in a work context, I think kindness is just that difference between, you know, turning up and going to work and being really happy and feeling kind of valued and belonging. It makes that difference, I think. One of the things that stands out was just the thoughtfulness that I've seen, actually not in a work context, but in social context, with people looking out for elderly people who are self-isolating and supporting them as they stayed at home. I just saw lots of examples through the work I do with the church, actually, of people just going that extra mile really to support people who were, having to self-isolate, make sure that they didn't feel alone, and just look out for them. And the feedback that I had from the people receiving that was that it just meant the world to them. So those are the things that really stand out, I think, in my mind.
Kindness to me is a language that breaks all barriers. It provides us with strength to face and overcome challenges. Kindness is truly the golden thread that makes us all human. It takes only a small act of kindness to help and bring meaning to a person's life. I experienced this when early this year I developed COVID. Symptoms were crippling and debilitating. However, the acts of kindness, such as a comforting phone call, a message, shopping, food, etc., from my colleagues, friends, and family, helped me pull through and recover. So for me, kindness, in a nutshell, is the essence of human life.
I think it is part of human nature, or should be a part of human nature, where people consciously consider others and want to do well by others, which would both be an act of kindness or might be a very discreet action that leads to kindness coming to an individual. I think because we, being humans, are interrelational, interactions with people are really important, and positive interactions are especially important. So it's a bit about being a positive force in each other's lives through kindness. At the height of the pandemic, our complementary therapy team were actively going to members of the ward team and offering complementary therapy at lunchtimes and after work, which really kept the motivation up of the ward staff, and showed such a level of caring for the ward staff in the predicament that they found themselves, and that was totally motivated by the enablement team looking out for their colleagues.
Kindness is about giving without thought of receipt. It's based on consideration of the understanding and the needs of others without thought for self-gain. Kindness is important because it creates happiness, both in ourselves and in others. And kindness makes us all feel better about ourselves and others. I'm reminded of a letter sent by a lady to a social care worker that I was copied into, thanking her for the support she'd given in helping her husband of 40 years move into residential care. And the lady didn't have to write the letter. And the reason she wrote the letter was because of the kindness shown to her by the social care worker. And the social care worker was just doing her job, but it was the way that she did the job. It was the way that she acted with kindness to this lady who was in pain and anguish. And I think it's an example of how kindness begets kindness. So the act of the social worker in being kind to the lady in the way that she supported the lady was then responded to by an act of kindness by somebody who was going through probably one of the most troubled times of their lives.
Kindness is about being friendly, being supportive, and ensuring that others feel included. It's about looking after people in the way in which we want to be looked after ourselves. And I think really importantly, it's about behaving in private the same as we behave in public. It's clear that lots of people are struggling at the moment. Life was difficult before COVID, and COVID has made our working lives and our personal lives even more challenging. I think the moral case around being kind is obvious, but beyond that, when you look after people, it's easier for them to do a good job. So the quality of care that patients receive improves. And when people are happy at work, and I think kindness can support happiness at work, it positively impacts on our personal lives. So I live in a village in South Leicestershire, and a couple of months into COVID we set up a village WhatsApp group. And the key aim of that was trying to look after the people in our village. There's lots of retired people there, there's people who live on their own. So using the WhatsApp group, people were able to purchase food for people, to collect medication, to look after the vulnerable, to check in with people. And I sense that we communicated, and we are communicating in a way that had been absent for the last 8 years in the village. And as we've had some form of normality return to our personal and working lives, although it continues to be far from normal, that sense of village life and us as a collective working together has continued, and I hope it continues for much longer too.
Thank you very much, Joe, for sharing that. Apologies to those of you who have probably been to a few sessions and have seen that a few times, but again, kindness is the underpinning theme here. So just to move us on to the session then, my name is Liz McIntyre. I'm Director of Education, Learning and Development at Loros Hospice in LLR. Today's session is going to be on well-being and resilience, responsibility of the organisation or the individual, and that's going to be led by Ben, who will introduce himself in a second. I will facilitate the chat, so please, any questions that you have as you go through, please do put them into the chat. And if you could, at this point, at least keep your cameras and your microphones turned off, that would be most appreciated. Thank you very much. I will hand over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Bear with me 1 second. It places the occasional bit of cognitive load on me. I spend most of my life on Zoom at the moment, and so sometimes when I get onto Teams, it takes me a moment to find the right window to share. So I think that should be the right one. Hopefully everyone can see that. Can you see that there, Liz? Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about resilience is the responsibility of the individual organisation and around that topic. So, as Liz said, my name is Ben Tipney. I'm founder and managing director of MedLed, and we run training, consultancy and support around human factors for healthcare, a term that some of you may be familiar with, some of you not, and that's fine. So my background's not clinical. I come from a high performance sport background, so I was part of the British rowing team for a number of years. Rowing's one of those funny little niche sports that people take an interest in once every 4 years. I don't know if any of you ever noticed this. The Olympics comes on, you suddenly find yourself taking interest in sports you had no interest in any other time. I remember watching the Olympics at Tokyo and suddenly thinking to myself, I've developed a critical opinion about rhythmic gymnastics, and how does that happen? When I stepped away from rowing, I realised it was one of those sports for everybody else. Sadly, my journey didn't culminate anything too exciting like Olympic gold medals or anything like that. I did a couple of world championships and retired at the grand age of 23 with a back injury. I was fortunate enough to coach in that area for 15 years, which included coaching at the world championships with South Africa in 2010. I lived out there for a few years. And I suppose, cutting a long story very short, having worked really broadly with a whole lot of teams in sport, in education, in the corporate world, one of the things I noticed in when I was coaching in rowing was that high levels of technical skill gave you a high level, was a necessity for high performance, but it didn't give you consistency of performance. Consistency of performance came through things like how people manage pressure, how people work as teams, how you as a coach can put systems of support around athletes to help them get the best in themselves. I didn't have the language of human factors, human performance, or anything like that back then, but it kind of laid the foundation for the sort of work that we do now. We have a really, really interesting, diverse team from a range of different backgrounds and work with teams and organisations right across the NHS as well as private sector and globally as well. So I want to look at a few things today, which is exploring some different perspectives on this term resilience. I think it's almost become a dirty word in some senses, and I want to talk about why. So actually defining what we mean by it. Talk about working complex systems, and this word complex, I think it's used a lot. What do we actually mean by that? And then taking a human factors approach to resilience, and what we mean by that, and what some of the ways forward might be. And I don't know how many of you know what sort of connotations you get when you hear the words well-being, wellness, resilience. certainly, you know, we may have seen some of these sorts of things that's coming around, and I have a lot of really interesting chats with, you know, for example, with junior doctors. I remember having a chat with a junior doctor a while back who was saying like the biggest source of stress and angst for them was the fact that they, you know, they literally couldn't find anywhere to park when they came to work. You know, such a simple thing that was causing them a lot of angst. The fact that they couldn't get, at one point, they couldn't get time off because of rotoring issues to attend a close family member's wedding. You know, sound like simple things, but really significant. And you can imagine, so we're going to put on a seminar on mindfulness for you in replacement of that. How helpful is that? So there's a strong argument but made by a lot of people that resilience we shouldn't be putting the onus on individuals to simply be more resilient in the face of organizational issues. There is a counter argument to this, which is, and there's a really interesting phrase from a chap called Sean Aker, and he's a psychologist at Harvard, and he's done a brilliant, and some of you if you've ever done sessions with me before, you know, he's done a brilliant video called The Happiness Advantage, which you can find on the TED website or on YouTube. And this phrase stands out for me in the stuff he says. He said it's not our reality that shapes us, but the way our brain processes the world around us that shapes our reality. And the point he's making is that actually all of us will face difficulties to varying degrees. Clearly, you know, it doesn't matter who you are in the world, there's always someone better off than you, and there's always someone worse off than you. Actually, it's how we respond and are internally to the things that happen to us that will shape the way we are and feel and perform in ourselves. So there's one argument to say actually the onus should be on the individual to change the conditions people are working in to make the organization more resilient. And there's an argument to say, actually, you'll never be able to create a perfect set condition. So actually, we all have to take steps to develop strategies that enables us to cope in a world that is difficult. We still actually haven't really defined what we even mean by resilience. And I do apologize if this is perhaps a topic that's been covered elsewhere in this conference. There's a couple that I've picked out, and one is from the American Psychological Association, who define it as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. So the capacity to adapt. The simple Wikipedia definition is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, which is the one I kind of like. It's this capacity to cope and recover from difficult circumstances. So it isn't, I think the thing we have to be cautious of with the use of this term, it isn't, in inverted commas, just toughen up. It's the capacity to cope with, process, and then recover from difficult circumstances. And I think that's important to outline at this stage. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the work that goes on in healthcare. And whether, you know, do you think it's simple, complicated, or complex? And I'm, you know, if anyone has any thoughts on this, you know, please do put it in chat. And actually, what do we even mean by the difference between complicated and complex work? And this is something we've been discussing a lot recently, and we've got a paper coming out around this very soon. And I've pulled this out of the paper that a couple of my colleagues have written. And this term complexity is used a lot within healthcare, or within safety science in general, to be honest. But it's become this synonymous for difficult. And I would argue simple work can be difficult. There's a difference between complexity and difficulty. And that then limits how we explore the work we do and how we attempt to solve problems. So embracing complexity within a human factors for healthcare approach, and I'm going to come on to talk about that in a second, doesn't mean work is difficult. It means it's different. And then when I say different, I mean different to work in other sectors. There's an awful lot of comparison between healthcare and other sectors, with aviation particularly, with the nuclear industry, with sport. There was even a book a few years ago called What If Disney Ran Your Hospital? So comparing healthcare to the entertainment industry. And I always feel that single industry comparisons fall down. I'm going to talk about that as we go through the session. And there's a really lovely blog about complexity by a lady called Suzette Woodward. Again, some of you might have come across. And she describes this in a brilliant way. And simple work is baking a cake. Now, any of you who've tried to bake a cake or watched the Great British Bake Off will know baking a cake is not easy, or certainly baking a cake well is not easy. However, it's simple. By simple, what we mean is it's linear. It can be defined into, it can be broken down into clearly definable steps. It's about following a recipe. And if you know, the worst thing you can do in baking is deviate and wing it. And you have to be a real expert baker, but even then there is a right and a wrong level of ingredients. So success is due partly to having a well-written recipe by someone who knows what they're talking about. I don't know if you ever feel like the rules that you're given to follow in your work were written by someone who doesn't actually understand your work. So well-written recipe or set of rules that are written in a way that's easy to follow, and the person following them has the opportunity to practice, and you have the resources at your disposal to do it. And it's, you can break it down, you can clearly define what right and wrong looks like. That it's not easy, but it's simple, and getting it right once gives you a very high probability of getting it right second time. And if you get it wrong, it's because you mismeasured something, or you hadn't done it before, so you misunderstood something. Complicated work is where you bundle a lot of things that on their own are simple together. So something like putting a rocket into space, which sounds very complex, but actually it isn't. It can be broken down into mathematical equations. It's a question of maths and physics, right? You can break the necessity, the kind of needs for putting a rocket into space into a set of algorithms, equations. And if you have the right, you might need a lot of expertise in the room to write them in the first place. But once you've done it successfully once, your chances of doing it successfully again in future are very high. So it sounds complex, but actually isn't, because it can be broken down, and you can still largely clearly define right and wrong. You can clearly define steps, and you can clearly define essentially the recipe, if you like. Complexity, and for anyone here who are parents will understand this, complexity is raising children. And the thing I love here, and as a parent of a 2.5-year-old and a 5.5-month-old, I can tell it's that notion of getting something right with the first one does not give you a guarantee that it's going to work the same with the second one. You learn that. And in fact, even with one, I don't know why, for months, my 2.5-year-old favorite thing in the world is peas. Yesterday, she wouldn't eat peas. I don't know why, but this is the thing. Every child is a unique human being. So there might be some generically applicable principles that work with most children. Most parents might say it's probably not a great idea to hit children. That might be something most parents agree with all children. But understanding that isn't sufficient for success, right? So there might be some general guidelines that you follow, but you cannot break raising children or raising a child down into a set of algorithms and equations. So no matter how good you get, no matter how hard you work, no matter how many previous successes you have, there's always a level of uncertainty around the outcome that remains. And I've put the link to the blog around this, and this links into different approaches to safety. And this is, again, and do excuse me for those who've heard me speak before, because I know I do sort of bang on about this a lot, but I think it's still it's fundamental, and we still haven't. It's not talked about enough. Every single time I hear people talking about safety and improvement, we talk about safety as equal to risk being minimized, or we talk about improvement as reducing variation. And that is sometimes exactly what we want. In some circumstances, risk reduction is appropriate, risk avoidance is appropriate, standardization and reducing variance is important. If the variation is unhelpful, if the variation we're getting is because we have a lack of good design, so you have anaesthetists who have to adapt to different types of equipment because there's a lack of standardization in the equipment that they're given, that's unhelpful variation. So they have to adapt to what's in front of them because that's the only way they can work. That's not the most effective way of doing things. So the approach in a lot of sectors, the aviation industry, nuclear industry, is standardization. It is drilling people to do the same thing over and over again, clearly defining, there's a right and a wrong way to deal with an engine fire and an aircraft. So the power is given to the regulation of the system to essentially minimize the need for human judgment. Humans will make mistakes, so it's minimizing the need for judgment, and risk is bad. At the other end of the spectrum is you know, a military war zone where there is huge variance in what you're dealt with. There's huge unpredictability. There's a lot of uncontrollables. You know, in the military, there's you know, a common phrase is no plan survives first contact. What they mean by that is you should make plans, but you could make the best plan you can possibly do with the information you have at the time, and that plan will fail at some point, not because it was a bad plan, but because you didn't have all the information when you made it. And there's an acceptance that actually in most circumstances, there's always information that you don't yet have. So it's this actually adaptation and recovery and building flexibility into the system to say, well, here's the way we think you should do things, but actually we're going to give you space to make judgments as new information arises, which I guess is very much what we saw in the early days of COVID. So the whole approach and mindset around safety, around improvement, the whole organizational approach is one of flexibility and adaptation. These are two extremes, and of course there is a midpoint, and really this is a sliding scale. And I think this is important to talk about, because at the one end of the spectrum, where some of healthcare should exist, it is about designing the things around people to create safety. At the other end of the spectrum, the capacity of human beings to react and respond and be resilient under pressure is always going to be a big component of performance. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So human factors for healthcare is an endeavor to create conditions that allow people to be and perform at their best. Right. And there's a chap called James Reason, who's written an awful amount of, you know, probably one of the preeminent through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s authors around human factors, safety science, risk and governance type work. And I like this quote from him, that we cannot change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under which humans work. And I think breaking down this word conditions is important. So we think about 3 lines of inquiry. So we've got this inquiry about the internal function of human beings, so human performance, so how human beings process the world around us, understanding our capabilities and limitations. And this is going to be similar to those of you who work in mental health. So my mum's a counselling psychologist. A couple of our team are clinical psychologists. So any of you here, you know, who work in that area, so a CBT therapist might work with people with disturbances around their cognition, their thought processes, their emotional reactions to things, their previous experiences, their beliefs, their schemas, and how the patterns of thought and feeling and belief and behavior and physiology all interweave and kind of impact on people's performance, their behavior and their well-being. And that's not only true for people who are in a troubled state, it's true for all of us all of the time. And there are various things that we can all do to better understand our capabilities, our limitations, our own internal patterns, you know, whether it be meditative practice, mindfulness. There's a plethora of strategies we can use to better understand our own internal processes and the way we process the world around us that enable us to better cope with the world around us. So there's also, the better we understand the function of human beings and how humans function, how we process the world, how we make decisions, it also plays into giving us a better understanding in terms of interpersonal dynamics. So obviously this is the focus of a lot of work around leadership, team working, communication, you know, huge bodies of work in this area, but an understanding of that internal functions of human beings gives you a much better, the capacity to much better understand how your behavior might impact on the people around you. And obviously this is a massive, healthcare is delivered by people for people, and certainly within my lifetime will continue to be so. So this is a huge element of performance. That's the second line of inquiry. The third one is this external, the designing for people. Like, are you ever given a piece of equipment and you look at it and think, well, I don't know who designed that, but they've certainly never done my job. Or you think, I can understand how that works in theory in someone's head, but in practice, it's not going to. So it could, the physical ergonomics of equipment and the environment you work in, about whether that makes the job easier or more difficult, the technology you interface with, you know, how often is it more difficult to do the job because you can't access the information because the IT system isn't it's not user-centered. There's a great phrase, which is the difference between functionality and usability. I once stayed in a house and the oven, every time you opened the oven and shut it again, you had to press a start button to keep the oven going. It's the only oven I've ever known. How many times do you think I put my chips in, and I went in 10 minutes later to check on them, turn them over, and I shut the oven and forgot to press start? Because no other oven I've ever used, it's not a normal thing. My brain isn't tuned into automatically doing it. I kept coming back 10 minutes later and the oven was cold. So it was functional. It heated food. There's nothing wrong with the way it works from a functional perspective, but it wasn't designed with the user in mind. And again, the better you understand the internal functions of how humans work, the better you can design for people. So technology, equipment, but also the processes, the policies, the rules, the guidance we have to follow. So all of the external things around people. And actually the interplay between these and how big the focus needs to be on one over the other is massively context dependent. So we sort of look at 5 central principles, which is taking a systems approach. And the key thing here is we never treat behavior in isolation. Behavior is a symptom, not a cause. So the behavior, the metaphorical tip of the iceberg, what you see people doing is driven by internal and external factors. So there's internal systems and there's external systems around people. And we need to better understand those if we want to improve performance, well-being, and safety. Embracing complexity. So that's looking at, is the work being done, is it simple, complicated, or complex? So where do we need to sit in that models of safety? What does good look like in terms of, are we trying to constrain through design, or are we trying to create flexibility for judgment? The multi-person interface, and this is why in healthcare, I think the interpersonal and sort of team dynamics of how we function with each other, and we heard some of this earlier around kindness, is always going to be a big factor of performance, perhaps more so. You walk into a nuclear plant, there's hardly anyone there. It's all equipment and there's not much going on. It's all automated. And that's because it can be. It's very equipment heavy and people light. And the approach to how we do things is then governed by that. So we just have to be cautious of it sometimes when we look at learning from those other sectors. There's useful stuff to take away, no doubt, but we have to exercise an element of caution. So contextual flexibility, because healthcare is not a homogenous industry. No other sector I know of is as varied. And I sort of like compare orthopedic surgery to community mental health, community psychiatry. And I think, so a psychiatrist working in a community team and the orthopedic surgeon at medical school, if they're around the same age, studied the same stuff. So the initial underlying training is the same. But then their specialty training is very different, and the jobs they're doing it's like comparing table tennis to basketball. Yes, some of the same skills around hand-eye coordination and agility might be helpful, but everything, it's so different. So our approach needs to be governed by the context. And these twin interdependent aims of performance and well-being. So, a human factors approach will see well-being as an output of the system, predominantly rather than the kind of an individual endeavor. So we should see these two outputs of improving performance and improving well-being as twin, interdependent, interwoven, that we never seek one without the other. So we never seek one at the expense of the other. We see these two twin interdependent aims at all times. And that's where, because what we tend to see is quality improvement work, which is performance orientated. Although I will say that I'm seeing more and more QI work that is well-being orientated, but predominantly in certainly in inception, it is a performance orientated activity, and then well-being activities which are sort of separate. And what I'd like to see happening is this sort of coming together of that sort of work. I suppose to go a bit further, going back to some of the internal functions of humans, we need to understand the relationship between stress and performance, because to me this is fundamental to so much of what happens. And there's some really good research in this by a chap called Sam Vine at Exeter University. And as probably most of us have experienced, initially, like no stress at all, if you don't care about what you're doing, if you're not fussed about whether, if I say, well, how much do you care about whether you succeed or fail in this task? And you go, well, I don't care. You're not going to get your best performance because you're not motivated enough. The level of arousal is not sufficient to push you to do your best, right? So some stress is necessary, right? So from none to some improves performance. Beyond that, something interesting happens. as stress continues to improve, either performance continues to improve. In reality, the line doesn't continue going up, it will level out, and it will level out because your level of skill will limit. Like your performance can't go on indefinitely. You'll hit a ceiling in whatever your ceiling level of skill is, right? If your ceiling of skill is a 7 out of 10, you're not going to, stress isn't going to push you to an 8. Once you get to a 7, you will level out. However, very often you won't get as far as a 7. What will happen is sometimes you get to a point where instead of it getting up to the level of your skill limit and leveling out, you'll get a sooner drop off. And what Sam Varney's team talked about is the difference between a challenge response and a threat response. So one is where under high stress, people are still performing at a high level and sustaining that, and one where they're raising up initially and then dropping off. Something I think that is worth mentioning at this stage, but thinking about the context of this whole event, high performance under pressure isn't sustainable indefinitely, right? It's a bit like, I don't know if any of you have ever been pulled onto the motorway in a car, assuming you have a manual, and you change and you pull on, and maybe because you're listening to music, you don't realise that you're doing 70 miles an hour and you're still in third gear. I've done it once or twice, and you realise you're suddenly banging off the rev limiter. Cars are absolutely fine. Like, the car is designed to be able to rev to that point, right? So when you pull out of a junction and you have to accelerate hard in first, second, third to pull into the flow if you're trying to get into a small gap, the car is absolutely fine. It's designed to do that, provided you then do eventually change up and you let the revs drop, and you do periodically refill it with fuel, and you periodically change the oil, and you have it serviced once a year and all that stuff. If you drive it at the red line continuously and you never stop for fuel and you don't change the oil and all that, you will blow up the engine. You cannot sustain it indefinitely. So human beings are capable of performing under stress, and actually stress can, under certain conditions, push us to actually produce our very best, but it does have it is wearing on the system, right? High levels of adrenaline for long periods of time are wearing, and this is, I think, an issue for us right now, is how do we get recovery? And I know there's been a lot through this week around how we recover, and I hope we've been able to take advantage of some of those sessions. So there's some interesting research going back to sort of the performance side around football and penalties specifically, and bear with me around why I'm using this example. It's an interesting one because a penalty kick is a very discrete, isolated skill, right? You're taking lots of factors out of it. It's a single kick. It's attacker versus goalie. You're taking all the complexity out of it. It's a very simple, singular skill. Now, the success rate in what you might call a low jeopardy penalty, it's relative. So what we mean by that is you're the first penalty taker, right? You step up, and whether you score or miss, it matters, but it's not the end, right? The penalty shootout will carry on. Success rate there is about 85% at professional level, right? There's a massive piece of research that, over years, over a dozen, hundreds of tournaments across the world, where it's a shot to win the game, right? So you're stepping up, it's the World Cup final, the other team have missed a couple, so this is it. If you score this one, your team's through, you've won. They don't have enough chances to come back. And when I ask people what they think the percentage is, having knowing that the kind of standard, in practice or low jeopardy is 85%, most people go, 50, 40, 60, they think it's low. It's 93%. The stress of that situation, this is a high stress situation, but where it's a shot to win the game, it's 93%. When it's a shot not to lose, imagine this scenario. It's the World Cup final, you're standing up to take the penalty, and of course this is exactly what happened to poor Saka, one of the England players in the recent tournament against Italy in the final, the Euro 2020. That wasn't 2020, but there we go. He stepped up knowing that because England were behind in the shootout, and if he missed, there weren't enough chances left for England to come back. If he missed, that was it. It was out. That England were out. If he scores, it carries on. So either team could still win. But if he misses, that's it. It's over. And he did miss. And in this scenario, the success rate is 63%. It's a 30% swing. The only thing is different is whether it's a shot to win or a shot to lose. What you see in the challenge response, you get the adrenaline, but the threat response, you get the adrenaline and the cortisol. And it's the cortisol that gives us the cognitive inhibition, the inability to think clearly. So what I'm interested in is, what are the factors in our environment that dictate whether something is threatening or challenging? And there are three main, and you know, given more time, we can go into these in more depth. First is our relationship with stress itself. There's a great talk by a lady called Kelly McGonigal, and I think it's called Make Stress Your Friend. TED Talk. It's on YouTube. So how we frame and talk about stress. You know, do we talk about stress as the enemy? And we know there's research with the British rowing team. Athletes whose mindset around nerves, where their mindset is, oh, nerves, I need strategies to reduce my nerves, i.e. nerves are bad, they're the enemy, I need to reduce them. They tend to perform worse under very high pressure. Athletes whose mentality to nerves is, oh, nerves, this is my body getting ready to perform. This is my body getting ready to action. So it's a neutral, it's a normal biological response. There's no real good or bad thing about nerves. Or even a positive relationship. Oh, nerves, how can I harness this better than my competitors? Tend to perform better under pressure. This is an example of something that's simple but difficult. This this could take years to work on, to really reframe this deep down within yourself. So this is a good example of saying it's all very well to say this stuff, right? So I can tell you now, reframe stress in your mind. Do you think I always see stress in a positive way? I know this stuff intellectually. I find it really hard, right? Because we're so socialized that stress is a bad thing. So there's no good just saying to individuals, just reframe stress. Yes, we should work on it. Yes, we should think about how we frame and talk about stress. But this is not a solution in itself. This is a long-term thing. So our perception of our ability to cope is massive, essentially confidence. If your ability is a 7 out of 10, right, in a given task, right, we're just going to use your ability scale. If I give you a task, so your actual ability is a 7 out of 10. But your perception of your ability is a 5 out of 10. And you've got to go and do a task that is a 7 out of 10 difficulty. So you are actually technically capable of doing the task, but your perception of it is a 5. When the difficulty of the tasks are 1, well, you're not that motivated. It's really easy. But it starts creeping up, 2, 3, 4. It's now more challenging, but it's not yet reached your perception of your limits. So it's challenging, but it's not threatening. So you're performing well. As soon as that reaches a 5, 5.5, now it's starting to exceed your perception of your limits. So our perception of our ability and our perception of the resources we have to cope with whatever we're doing will massively impact how we perform under pressure. And what you tend to see is when the difficulty exceeds their perception of their ability, their performance will drop off, because you go into a threat state, you get the cognitive inhibition, fight, flight, and freeze, you go into the internal defensive survival mode, and you perform worse. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you've just proved to yourself that you can't do it, whereas actually you had that ability. So this is the importance of like supportive peer mentoring, positive reinforcement, good quality experiential learning, mentoring, shadowing, simple positive reinforcement, positive feedback. When anything that builds confidence, yes, overconfidence. We overstate the problem of overconfidence, and we all have the example of, oh yeah, so-and-so's, they think they're an 8 and they're actually a 4. Actually, really, what normally the person who's overtly very brash and arrogant, that's usually a coping mechanism for underlying lack of confidence. Genuine overconfidence is usually quite short-lived. It usually happens. There's a great thing called the Dunning-Kruger curve. When we know very little, we know very little, then we learn enough to think we know more than we do. And we have this short-term period where we think we know a lot more than we really do, but then we quite quickly realize we learn a bit more, and we realize we know enough to know what we don't know. And then you go through actually quite a long period in careers where, and this is kind of, I feel like I am now with most of this stuff, I know enough to know what I don't know. And what I don't know feels quite daunting sometimes, because as soon as you look at humans and systems, you think, shit, there's still so much to know. And actually, so I think most people who are good at what they do tend to state their abilities and the other way around. So that's massive. And then the third one is the level of psychological safety. So the social conditions that people exist in. And if you ask people about what psychological safety is, Most people think, oh, it's just being nice to each other, isn't it? Just make sure you don't upset anybody. And actually, that misses the point completely. And Amy Edmondson, who's done a great talk around this on TED Talk around the rescue of the Chilean miners, and has written a book called The Fearless Organization, which I would recommend. I have no commercial connection, by the way. She uses this phrase, which is creating an environment for safe conflict. Psychological safety is actually creating an environment where we can constructively disagree with one another. It's not tiptoeing around on eggshells. So you can define it as a shared belief with people in the team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Like disagreeing with someone, it feels like an interpersonal risk. I don't know how they're going to respond. So making it people feel safe to do that. It's characterized typically by interpersonal trust and respect. These are words we're going to come back to, where people feel comfortable being themselves, bringing their full self to work. I often feel that like people bring a smaller version of themselves to work, a slightly lesser version of themselves. I met a maternity care assistant once, and I was chatting to her before a course, and it turned out that this lady had a master's in forensic psychology and had spent a decade working with young offenders, and that this was a second career for her after having children. And I was like, wow, what an amazing set of skills that you have. How do the team utilize, like how does your organization make use of this? She said, well, no one knows, no one's ever asked. So she was bringing a smaller version of herself to work, and I think that often happens. So a sense of confidence that the team won't embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. So if we disagree with someone, that we won't be chastised. If we make a mistake, we won't be made to feel foolish. If we suggest an idea that turns out not to be a very good idea, we won't be made to feel silly for that. And I won't go on too much around the research evidence, because you can find it in the book, and there's a lot online, and I've got links in here. But we know that it's linked to mortality rates. There's a direct link between whether people feel able to be open about concerns and mortality rates. That was 137 trusts across England. We know that in quality improvement work, if people feel psychologically safe with those around them, we tend to get systemic improvements rather than what we call the silent workarounds, where people find a solution for themselves on that day, but they don't talk to anyone else about it. But we also know that if we push people to do better, but we don't improve psychological safety. So we push safety standards. This means someone in the organization stands up and says, we need to do better at patient safety, but they don't improve psychological safety. People actually make more errors. What you've done is create a threat. If you push safety standards, like you raise your expectations of what people should be doing and how well they should be working, but you also improve psychological safety, people make less errors. It's become a challenge, not a threat. Right? So psychological safety is this factor that I guess influences how well people can perform under pressure. So how do we do it? This I'd love to be able to tell you in 5 minutes, but there are a few things we can think about. Where are the opportunities where you have the moment where's the opportunity for you to communicate to those around you that you don't have all the answers? Because that moment where you look at someone and you say, I don't have all the answers here, what do you think? That is building psychological safety, because it's communicating that you acknowledge that you don't know everything. We all know that we don't know everything, but very often people that are less experienced look at someone more experienced and they think, oh, well, they know it all. We know intellectually that they don't, but we still see them in that way. And I think sometimes we worry that saying I don't know suggests a lack of confidence, and it's not. And we talk a lot about confident humility. Confidence and humility are not opposites on a spectrum. But I have confidence that I know some stuff that's valuable to share with others. But I hopefully have the humility to recognize there's still an awful lot I don't know. And I will never know even a fraction of what there is to know. And that gives me a curiosity about what other people think and about what other people have to say. And having listened, I may or may not agree with them, and I may or may not change my own perspective. That's up to me to decide later. But proactive inquiry, which is actively asking people what they think, not just waiting for them to come to us. But then when we ask a question, listen with the intent to understand, not with the intent to reply. And that requires us developing an attitude of curiosity over judgment. So listening before judging, which sounds simple, but requires a lot of work, because it requires us to put our own view to the side for a moment, which is easier said than done sometimes. So I think of psychological safety, and you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an academic. I try and think about things in fairly simple ways. This is always my challenge. How do you simplify complexity? Answers on a postcard. So psychological safety is like this delicate vase, right? So it's beautiful, but it takes years and it takes skill to create. It's very easily broken. And the tabletop it sits on is made up of the behaviors you see. And we heard some of this earlier in that video. And the behaviors, unsurprisingly, are kindness. Now, I promise you there was no scripting of this. Empathy, civility, and assertiveness. So kindness, you know, what we heard about earlier. Empathy, which is listening with the intent to understand. You know, a true empathy is not projecting our own feelings of right or wrong on someone else's feelings. True empathy is acknowledging without judging. I'm really sorry that you're feeling sad, angry, upset, frustrated, whatever, without judging. Yes, you're right to be sad, or no, you're wrong to be sad. It's just simply acknowledging, which is hard to do actually, because we tend to cast our judgments right or wrong on things. Civility, which is treating every human being we come into contact with as equally worthy of respect. Sounds simple, but because we're instinctively a hierarchical species, we tend to give a lot of deference to people in positions of power, and less so to people who aren't. And assertiveness, being honest about the things that are relevant to our objectives, you know, and dealing with behavior, not personalities. Right, so I think what you said to me was inappropriate rather than you're a bully. So being a balanced, we talk about balanced assertiveness. So these are the behaviors, but they're a product of the attitudes we bring with us. So do you trust people unless they prove themselves, unless they betray your trust? Or do you treat people cynically unless they prove themselves to be trustworthy? And I would suggest that the first one is the way we build psychological safety, because most people are typically trustworthy. You know, there's things, and they've done studies, most people, when someone drops a wallet in the street, will pick it up and give it to them. Yeah, the old person will pick it up and run away, but most people will give it. So do you trust first? We have to learn. If people betray our trust, right, we should learn from that, right? So trust, respect. Do we, like we say, see every human being as equally worthy of respect? The reality, of course, there are decision-making hierarchies, and decision-making hierarchies are typically based on skill and experience, quite rightly, or skill and expertise, I should say, because there is a difference between expertise and experience. But that doesn't mean that the person who is lower down in the decision-making hierarchy is any less worthy of respect. And so those two start with the humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers. And as soon as we have that, that spawns curiosity. And that curiosity means that when we ask questions, we actually listen to what people have to say, which is empathy. So these four attitudes, these are the legs of the table. And to be honest, if you don't work on these four and you try and force those four behaviors, people tend to see through it, right? If you just tick the box, oh, I better do some empathy, it doesn't tend to work very well. Whereas if we work on those four attitudes and we bring those with us, that tends to, those behaviors come out naturally. So, and the reason I put it up like this is, imagine you have this beautifully carved table and this stunning vase of psychological safety, but you go and leave the table out in the garden for 2 years and you never varnish it, you never look after it, you never dry it off, it'll rot and it will fall over and the vase will smash. Whereas if you look after it, if you nurture it constantly, it needs looking after constantly, then it'll stay stable. And that's why I think that commitment is important. There's one really nice phrase that I would add to this, which is call it out with compassion. This was from Chris Turner, and there's a lovely website called Civility Saves Lives, all around the impact of incivility on performance and well-being. And I like this. People often say, yeah, but what about those people who, you know, we're trying to be respectful and they're not? And the phrase is call it out with compassion, because as Chris says, it could be a good person having a bad day. Like you don't know what's happening for that person. So if you know, but you also promote what you tolerate. So if we walk past things that we think are inappropriate and are unkind and are disrespectful and we don't say or do anything, we're actually inadvertently promoting those behaviors. But when we call those out, we need to call out the behavior, not attack the person. And we also need to call out those behaviors in a way that is compassionate, kind, and respectful to that person, because we don't know what's going on for them, what's going on in their internal system, in their lived experience, right? So be the change you want to see. Be compassionate in the way you call out some behaviors, because very often it's a lack of awareness, for example. So call it out with compassion. I love that. So coming back to some of our original points. So the importance of psychological safety. If we get this right, when you think about the internal line of inquiry, people perform better under pressure, right? So if people are in a psychologically safe space, and that is the product of the behaviors in the team around them, people will be more resilient as a byproduct. People will also communicate more effectively with one another because they feel able to do so. So the teams will work more effectively, but will create far greater system learning because the information fed into our improvement work will be more accurate, right? So we'll get much better, more open dialogue and more honest dialogue about the work that goes on, about the issues that exist in the system. So it's always a work in progress. We're all creating ripples in the system around us all the time. And the question I have for you is, what are the ripples you're creating? And are they the ripples you would like to be creating? None of us can take responsibility alone. So resilience cannot ever be solely an individual endeavor. I do strongly believe that because of the complexity of the work that you're doing, you cannot design systems in healthcare in such a way to remove the value of having strategies, whatever those strategies are, for being able to cope better in difficult circumstances. Like I say, different things for different people: gratitude journals, mindfulness, yoga. These are 1,000,001 strategies that people to better train ourselves to be able to process and deal with challenges. However, that should never be a replacement for thinking about organizational resilience and team resilience. So resilience in itself is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty. We need a balance of focus across all three. So it isn't a simple either or, individual or organization. However, I think a really key message is we should never use a focus on providing things around individual wellness as a replacement for developing better organizational resilience. And to be honest, if we can work on and develop better psychological safety, this is key to all three of those. So that's the thing. It's not something you can measure at an organizational level. Trying to measure psychological safety as a big organization, it's like listening to Beethoven's symphony and saying the average note is duh. Doesn't mean anything. Psychological safety exists at the level of the team, and that's the level. So we can all influence it on every day. So I hope that was interesting for you. Any questions? So by all means, if there's a couple of Twitter handles there for those who are on the social media at MedLed Team or at Ben Tipney. I've put my email address there if anyone's got questions afterwards or wants to explore the stuff we do. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event and everyone stayed awake for the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well done, Ben. Thank you very much. Just a couple of points that people have just asked for clarification on. So the session will be recorded, and I think Joe's just said that the recordings for all of the sessions, including civility, which you mentioned, Ben, will be available next week on the website. But my understanding is that an email will go out with the links on it.
Have you got Chris doing a session?
There was one on Monday, Ben.
Yeah, we did a session on Monday, Ben. Hi, Ben. Really good to see you. It was a great session. Hiya. Yeah, we had a session on Monday, which was excellent. Around.
Yeah. So if anyone hasn't seen that already, that would definitely be one to go. If you found this one interesting, go back and look at that one as well.
I've done that. I've put the links in there. I put Amy Edmondson's link for the TED Talk in there for you. I've put the other one that you mentioned as well. You said Amy Edmondson, and what was the other one?
Oh, there's a couple. So Sean Akers one I would probably recommend, The Happiness Advantage.
Yes. And there was another one you said.
And then the other one was Kelly McGonigal, Making Stress Your Friend. I think that's the title of it.
That's in there. I put that in the chat box, okay, as well. And I've just found Sean Anchors, and I'll pop that in the chat box for everybody as well.
Yeah, lovely. Oh yeah, I just see. I couldn't see the chat coming through, so I'm just seeing it now.
Yeah, every time when you were mentioning stuff, I was going in and getting the YouTube video and whopping it in.
Yeah.
Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Feel free to put it in the chat or just put your hand up.
Emily Reed.
Hello there. Thank you, Ben. That's brilliant. Yeah, really on topic, so appreciate it. I just wanted to ask a bit more about sort of persistent stress and resilience, because I think there was something you mentioned about, if it's just continues and continues and continues, then that's where the burnout sort of hits in. And that's my aversion to the word resilience. I think it's like I should be more resilient and then I won't burn out. So can you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, so because what we're talking about when you get that kind of chronic stress buildup over time, it's no longer an issue of performance. It's an energy issue. But you're literally running out of energy. I often you talk about because people talk about time management, and actually time management's a myth. It's the one thing you can't manage. You can manage tasks, or you can manage energy, and energy, whether that's physical energy, emotional energy, mental energy, and spiritual energy, which doesn't have to be religious. It's kind of purpose and beliefs. And how do we recharge those? Like, how do you regain energy? So it's a balance between expenditure and recovery. So I often liken kind of managing energy or recovering as a bit like lifting weights. If I never go and do any weights, I'll never get any stronger. But equally, if I go and do leg weights today and again tomorrow and again the next day, and I never let myself recover, I'll have to hurt myself. So you have to balance. So say someone who finds meetings draining, if they avoid all meetings, they'll never develop the capacity to cope with that. But equally, if they go to meeting after meeting after meeting and they never do something that helps them recover mentally, emotionally from that, then they're going to get closer and closer to burnout. The thing we have to work on, the individual nature of this, is working out what works for you, because different people recover in different ways. And one activity might recharge you physically, but drain you mentally. And that's very much so. I do less at the moment, but I've historically done a lot of individual coaching, and that's kind of quite a focus in individual coaching, is helping working with people to figure out what things recharge them and which things drain them. I apologize, it doesn't give you a simple answer in the sense, but I think it's thinking about energy recovery rather than performance in that endeavor, and they can be often really small things. And that's why the people who say, well, resilience is an organizational thing, it shouldn't be an individual thing. Well, I agree as an overarching mindset, but at the same time, we still need to try and work out what strategies we can employ that help us to recover our energy where we can. Now, the organization needs to also help us. Where can the organization provide those opportunities? Where can the organization help to facilitate that? And what are the things that happen within the organization that drain people that could be changed?
Thank you. That's really good.
Thank you very much for the question, Emily. I'll come to you, Rachel, please.
Hi. This might actually lead quite well into what I was going to ask the end of the last person. So you talk about psychological safety, but what about kind of meeting the basic needs that come kind of before that? So everything was kind of about resilience and psychology and all that side of things, but I've started to hear the term staff welfare being used a lot more, and just being kind of mentioned in more kind of leadership conversations. And I guess it's like things like the car parking you mentioned at the beginning. So what are your thoughts about this and how they fit into kind of resilience?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things when you look at research around things like how, how I said Sean Akers got this, I don't know if you've ever seen any of his talks around this, called the Happiness Advantage, and he talks about it's about how our perception of what we're dealing with rather than what we're actually dealing with that affects how we see our life and how we see the world. But that's only true if our basic needs are met. So it's that it's similar to research around like salary, for example. There's a very poor correlation between what people earn and their long-term happiness and well-being. unless they're below a level where they can't meet basic needs. So there are certain basic needs that we need to be able to meet, sort of survival needs almost. And if those aren't met, then yes, absolutely. So if someone's overriding stress or concern is whether they can provide a meal for their children for the next week, then everything else can become secondary, because that is a fundamental welfare survival need for that person in that situation. So I think you're right. We have to recognise where that level of issue exists in someone's welfare, and unless those needs are addressed, then that becomes an issue. I suppose, yeah, the stuff around going back to the kind of needs around, I can't find a place to park my car. I can't get time off to attend things that matter to me. I think that we tend to have to look at the situation of the individual in that instance. I don't know if, Rachel, that answers your question or not.
Yeah, I think the sorts of things, obviously, like kind of these welfare things, like is there a hot meal if I'm working at night? Those sorts of things are kind of really important, and basic, simple, those kind of basic needs are met, things, so that you can then invest your energies and time into other things.
And I think that and that's kind of what I mean by that. I am an absolute believer in all the strategies to employ around things like mindfulness and other things you can do. However, if you're doing that and not doing the things like what you've just mentioned, then actually the act of providing those things that actually in themselves can be helpful can be toxic, because people can see it, even if it's not meant in that way, as a sticking plaster for other things that are in their mind more important. And you're right, some of the simple things, and that requires us to ask, what are the things that really matter and would make a difference to your work, to your capacity to function, whether it's finding somewhere to park, whether it's being able to access a hot meal on a night shift, whether it's having a chair to sit down when I have a break. There are some really, really simple things sometimes that would make a difference. So that's that organisational resilience, seeing resilience as an organisational responsibility first and foremost.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks, Ben. I'm just very conscious of time. It's 5:10. I think if there are any further questions for Ben, please do get in touch either via Twitter, via the handles. Otherwise, if there is anything else, if you want to submit them through the Academy or to Joe, we'll make sure that Ben gets them and that we can hopefully get some feedback for you. So thank you very much for your time, Ben. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining the session, and hopefully see you for some of the further sessions tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Just to say, don't get Don Berwick tomorrow, so people make sure they turn up. Should be a good session.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers.